Christmas Eve, a time of joy, of togetherness, of warmth. But for one family in Pearl, Mississippi, it became a night of bloodshed, a teenage love story shattered in an instant, a father wounded, helpless, and two young lives extinguished. What happened on that cold December night? A gunman standing in the yard, rage burning in his eyes. A young girl, barely 17, her fate sealed in seconds. A father watching in horror as his world collapsed. Was this an act of passion or something far more sinister? Who was Matthew Wilson? A troubled soul or a calculated killer? And the final question, one that lingers in the silence of that deadly night. Was this always meant to end in tragedy? Or was there a moment, a single moment, where it all could have changed? In the beginning, it seemed like any other young love story, the kind that unfolds in quiet towns where life moves unhurried and the world beyond feels distant. Heather King and Matthew Wilson were drawn to each other, though no one could say exactly why. Heather was 17, still in high school with a future waiting to unfold. She had friends, a close-knit family, and a world that still felt full of possibility. She was the kind of girl who laughed easily, who lit up in the presence of those she trusted. Matthew Wilson was older, 5 years her senior. At 22, his world was already shifting. No longer a teenager, not yet settled into adulthood. A young man searching for direction. He had been out of high school for years. Some said he was struggling to find his place. Others said he didn't seem to be searching at all. The two met through mutual connections. In a town like Pearl, paths cross easily, and for Heather and Matthew, it wasn't long before they did. What began as simple conversations soon became something more. Heather's friends noticed the change, text messages at all hours, secretive smiles, time spent away. At first it was exciting, the thrill of something new. He was older, independent, a man, not a boy. But over time, the excitement gave way to something else. Matthew had a presence about him, one that some found unnerving. He could be charming when he wanted to be, persuasive in a way that made people listen. But there was an intensity to him, something in the way he carried himself, in the way he spoke. He had a temper, but it was controlled until it wasn't. In the days before Christmas Eve, the town of Pearl carried on as it always had. Homes were adorned with wreaths and ribbons. Storefronts twinkled with festive displays. Families moved through their final preparations, wrapping gifts, gathering for church services, looking ahead to the promise of a new year. For most, it was a time of peace. But for Heather King, something weighed on her. In the final days before her death, there was a shift, a quiet tension. Those closest to her saw it in small ways, the way she checked over her shoulder, the moments where her laughter was cut short. It was the way she held her phone just a little tighter, the hesitation before answering a call. Matthew Wilson had not let go. He had spent weeks lingering at the edge of her life, waiting. The messages had become more insistent. I need to talk to you. Why are you doing this? I can't just walk away. Some were pleading, some were angry. But all of them shared the same message. This was not over. Heather did not reply. But silence is never really silent. It carries meaning. And to Matthew, it was the only answer he needed. On December 23rd, the night before, Heather was at home. The scent of pine filled the air. A Christmas tree stood in the corner of the room, wrapped in soft golden light. She was with family, her father close by, a sense of comfort in his presence. And then the phone rang. She saw the name. She let it ring. Another call, then another. She put the phone down. Minutes later, a text. Answer me. She didn't. Matthew Wilson was somewhere in Pearl that night, alone, in his car, parked outside a gas station, engine humming. The cold December air pressed against the windows, but inside his mind was racing. His fingers hovered over the screen of his phone. Another message. I know you're there. No response. What went through his mind in that moment? The stillness of the car, the glow of the streetlights overhead, the knowledge that she had moved on, left him behind. Perhaps that was when he made the decision. Or perhaps the decision had already been made. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, morning came. The town moved through its final preparations. The last-minute shoppers filled grocery aisles, searching for missing ingredients. Children counted down the hours until Santa's arrival. Inside Heather's home, the day unfolded like any other Christmas Eve. Music played softly in the background, the warmth of family surrounded her. But Matthew was still waiting. At 2:17 p.m., another text. I just need to see you. Heather did not respond. At 4:42 p.m., a missed call. At 6:09 p.m., another. At 7:15 p.m., he sent what would be his final message. You're really going to do this to me? Heather never answered. By nightfall, Matthew Wilson was in his car again. This time, he was not parked outside a gas station. This time, he was heading towards Heather's house. The roads were quiet, the town still. The houses glowed softly, windows flickering with candlelight and television screens. He drove with purpose, his hands firm on the wheel. In the passenger seat, a loaded gun. Had he always planned to bring it? Or had he reached for it only now as a final decision? No one will ever know. At 8:30 p.m., Heather's home. Inside, the night carried on. A Christmas movie played on the television. The warmth of the holiday filled the house. Then footsteps outside. A knock at the door. Heather's father stood up. He opened the door. And there, standing in the cold, in the darkness, was Matthew Wilson. He was not smiling. He was not pleading. He was holding a gun. It was 8:31 p.m. when the first call came in. A frantic voice gasping for air. Shots fired! My daughter! Please! He has a gun! The dispatcher tried to steady the caller. A man's voice, trembling, urgent. The sound of his breathing, heavy. Where are you? Who has the gun? A pause. A voice, broken with fear. Matthew Wilson. He shot her. He shot my daughter. Then another sound. Muffled. A noise in the background. A struggle. And then gunfire. Loud bang. The line went dead. Heather, inside, heard the shot. She ran. Through the doorway into the night, her feet barely touching the ground. The kind of run driven not by speed, but by desperation. She did not make it far. Matthew turned, raised the gun. Another shot. Bang. Heather's body jerked, the force of the bullet stopping her mid-stride. She staggered, knees buckling, her breath caught in her throat. She fell. The world around her blurred. The cold from the earth rising up beneath her. The pain sharp, then dull, then distant. She tried to speak, but no words came. Her father, on the ground, wounded, watched in horror. He tried to move. The pain burned through his shoulder, but he pushed forward. Sirens in the distance. The sound of police closing in. Blue and red lights flashing in the dark, reflecting off windows, bouncing off tree branches. Matthew looked up. The world had closed in around him. The house, the yard, the cold. Heather, motionless on the ground, and then a final decision. He raised the gun, a single gunshot. The sound echoed through the neighborhood, a sound that for a moment silenced everything. Matthew Wilson fell, and just like that, everything was over. 8:34 p.m. The arrival of law enforcement. The first patrol car screeched to a stop. Officers moved quickly, weapons drawn, scanning the scene. 3 bodies, 1 man alive. Heather's father was clutching his shoulder, his voice weak but urgent. My daughter, please, my daughter. An officer knelt beside her, felt for a pulse. For a moment, everything stood still. The world held its breath. And then, the radio call. Female victim, unresponsive. We need paramedics now. A second officer moved toward Matthew Wilson. The gun was still in his hand. His fingers curled loosely around the grip. Blood pooled beneath him, spreading across the frost-covered ground. No movement, no pulse. One officer exhaled, lowering his weapon. It was done. Paramedics rushed in, their movements swift but measured. Heather's body was lifted onto a stretcher. Her father was treated at the scene, his wound bandaged, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The flashing lights painted the house in streaks of red and blue. The soft hum of Christmas music still played faintly from inside. And in the yard, marked off with yellow tape, 3 names were written in reports. Heather King, Matthew Wilson, and a father who would never forget the night his world was torn apart. Somewhere in Pearl, the church bells rang for midnight mass. But at one house, Christmas had ended before it ever began. By morning, the news had spread. In a town like Pearl, nothing stays quiet for long. Word traveled through hushed conversations in coffee shops, murmurs exchanged at gas stations, quiet sobs in the hallways of the high school. The town, once wrapped in the warmth of the holiday season, now felt colder. Christmas lights still flickered on rooftops, wreaths still hung on doors, but the spirit of the season had been replaced by something else. A sense of disbelief, a lingering shock. A young girl was gone. A father left to grieve, and a community struggling to understand why it had come to this. The investigation begins. By the time the sun rose over Pearl, investigators were already piecing together the final moments of Heather King's life. The crime scene had been examined in the dead of night, but daylight revealed more: the remnants of a struggle, footprints frozen in the dirt, bullet casings scattered across the yard. Detectives combed through the evidence. The firearm, a semi-automatic pistol, registered in Matthew Wilson's name. A weapon legally owned, but now forever tied to the events of Christmas Eve. The bodies positioned just feet apart. Heather, fallen where she had tried to run. Matthew, his final act carried out in the space between them. Police reports detailed the sequence with meticulous precision. Each shot accounted for. Each action frozen in time, recorded in black and white. But the most pressing question remained: why? Investigators turned to those who knew him best: friends, co-workers, former classmates, each with their own version of who Matthew was. Some described him as quiet, withdrawn, not someone who drew attention to himself. Others remembered a different side: short-tempered, easily frustrated, prone to moments of anger that surfaced without warning. But one detail stood out: possessiveness. It was a word repeated again and again in interviews with those who had seen his relationship with Heather up close. He didn't like her talking to other guys. He always wanted to know where she was. If she didn't answer his calls, he'd lose it. A pattern emerged. A relationship that, in the beginning, had seemed normal, but slowly, subtly had shifted. Heather had pulled away, and Matthew, unable to accept that, had held on tighter, until there was nothing left to hold on to. Investigators combed through phone records, text messages, social media exchanges. They looked for the signs, the warnings that had gone unnoticed or worse, ignored. And there, in the final messages sent before the shooting, the truth was laid bare. I just need to see you. You're really going to do this to me? If I can't have you, no one will. A single sentence written in the heat of rejection. A sentence that, in hindsight, had been a warning. One that came too late. Experts weighed in. A psychologist specializing in relationship violence was asked to examine the case, to explain why young men, in moments of emotional collapse, turn to violence. This is about control, she stated. When a person like Matthew Wilson feels they are losing control, they react in the only way they know how. For them, control is not just about power, it's about identity. And when that identity is threatened, they see no way forward. Her words were clinical, precise. This wasn't a sudden act. It was the culmination of weeks, months, maybe years of a pattern, a mindset where losing her wasn't an option. But knowing why does not bring solace. At the high school, students gathered. Teachers who had known Heather since childhood struggled to find the right words. Counselors sat with those who needed someone, anyone, to talk to. Her classmates left notes on her locker, flowers, pictures, a tribute to the girl they had lost. At the church, a vigil was held. The pews filled with faces, some familiar, some strangers, drawn together by grief. Heather's father sat in the front row, his arm in a sling, his body recovering from the wound that had nearly taken his life. But his eyes, they carried something no doctor could heal, a grief too deep for words. Matthew's family, not all mourned openly. At the Wilson home, the blinds remained drawn. Few visitors came. The weight of what had happened settled heavy on those who had raised Matthew, those who had known him as a child, before any of this. They, too, searched for answers. But the truth is never simple. Christmas in Pearl will never be the same. A week passed. Then two. The world moved forward, as it always does. But for the people of Pearl, the echoes of that night remained. The house where it happened, where the lights had once glowed warm against the winter air, stood quiet, a reminder of what was lost and what could never be undone. And yet, the question remains. What caused Matthew Wilson to raise a gun on Christmas Eve? What drove him to take the life of Heather King, to shoot her father, to turn the weapon on himself? There are no easy answers, no single moment that can explain what happened that night. But as investigators, psychologists, and those who knew them both look back, a picture begins to emerge, a picture of control, of possessiveness, of a relationship that was slipping through Matthew's grasp. There are those who believe that Matthew had been unraveling for weeks, that Heather's refusal to answer his calls, her choice to move on, had been the final push toward violence. Others argue that the decision had been made long before Christmas Eve, that the act was premeditated, a plan in his mind as he drove toward her home. The messages, the persistence, the way he arrived with a gun already in his hand, all signs that he had come not to talk, not to plead for one more chance, but to end things on his terms. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. The human mind is complex, emotions unpredictable, rejection is a powerful force. It can drive people to reckless actions, cloud their judgment, make them feel as if they have nothing left. This is not the first time, and it will not be the last. Across the country, across the world, stories like this one unfold with chilling regularity. Young love turning to obsession, possessiveness mistaken for passion, warning signs ignored or unnoticed until it is too late. Experts call it intimate partner violence, a term clinical in nature but devastating in reality. A cycle that begins with control, the small, seemingly harmless questions. Where are you? Who are you with? The quiet expectations that become demands. Why didn't you answer my call? Why are you avoiding me? Then come the isolation tactics. They don't understand us. You don't need them. By the time the threats begin, the victim is already entangled. And for some, when control begins to slip, when their grip is pried open, violence becomes the final act. What causes someone to believe that if they cannot have another person, no one can? How does love, something meant to bring comfort and joy, twist into something deadly? And, most importantly, how do we stop it? The answer is complex. Education, awareness, recognizing the warning signs early, teaching young people that control is not love, that jealousy is not affection. But even with knowledge, cases like this continue, and the question remains, was there a moment, a single second in time, where it all could have changed? And if there was, who missed it?